Salem's story. A story written by Abraham. Abraham tells Salem's story as he heard it from the lips of Melchizedek, on the occasion when they went up to Salem to celebrate Sukkot's party, after the Great Liberation. Adonias, tired of the iniquities of the people and inspired by the virtues of his beloved son, builds a city, a kingdom different from all others. After experiencing the joy of victory and the lamentation of perdition, Melchizedek receives a revelation from an angel, in which he declares that all that drama he was living had a prefigurative sense, portraying past and future events, which involved the whole vast universe. See Chrono. 1 and 2. Peace. 4 Salem subjects would not wield bows and arrows, but would be trained in musical art. Each inhabitant of Salem would always have at his fingertips a musical instrument, to express through him the peace and joy of that new kingdom. Together, they would form a powerful orchestra in the fight against disharmony born of pride and selfishness. 5 The first step of Adonias for the concretization of his plan was to elaborate the laws of the new kingdom, which he wrote them in a parchment. Salem's subjects could not lie, steal, hate, or kill their fellow men. Pride and selfishness were indicated as the cause of all evil, therefore they could not exist in that place of peace. 6 The laws of parchment required the practice of humility, sincerity, friendship, and above all, the love that is the greatest of all virtues. 7 After registering on the parchment the laws that would govern that kingdom, Adonias began to plan the architecture of Salem. It would be a city at first small, with rooms for 1,200 people. As the place of its construction, a high region of Canaan, west of the Mount of Olives, was chosen. 8 In a short time, the realization of Adonias began to attract people from all over the world who, from near and far, came to know the palaces and mansions that were being built. Admired by the beauty of that white city, visitors asked about who their inhabitants would be. Adonijah showed them the scroll, saying that Salem was destined for the clean of heart, those who were willing to obey his laws. Chapter 2. Conclusion of the Salem building. Melchizedek, his father's inspiration. Adonijah, seeking to honor a special subject, sees in Samuel a reflection of the prince's own virtues. Samuel is honored. 1 The building of the city was finally completed and Salem proved beautiful as an ornate bride, waiting for her husband. 2 Seated on his throne, Adonijah now examined the numerous candidates for subjects who came from everywhere. Those who, promising fidelity to the laws, were approved, received 3 gifts from the king: the right to a mansion, fine linen garments, and a musical instrument in which they should practice. 3 The city was finally full of inhabitants. Full of joy, Adonijah summoned everyone to Salem's inauguration party, during which he proclaimed a decree that would determine the future of that kingdom, saying, "For, from this day, which is the 10th of the 7th month, 6 years will be counted, in which all the inhabitants will be tested. Only those who remain loyal, progressing in the practice of the laws of parchment, will be confirmed as heirs of this kingdom of peace. Those who are bound by guilt and transgression will be banished by trial." 5 The king's words led everyone to a thorough examination of the heart, and they rejoiced with the certainty that they would achieve victory over all pride and selfishness, which are the roots of all evil. 6 Adonijah had an only child whom he had given the name of Melchizedek. The beauty, tenderness, and wisdom of that beloved son had been his inspiration for the edification and foundation of his kingdom. 7 Melchizedek was 12 years old when Salem was inaugurated. It was the plan of Adonias to crown him king over the approved subjects, at the end of the 6 years. This plan would keep it a secret until the right time. 8 The prince, with his virtues and sympathy, soon became very dear to everyone in Salem. He always had a smile and a word of affection on his lips. He appreciated being with the subjects in their homes, reciting the laws of the parchment in the form of beautiful songs that he lived composing. Its presence brought to the environment an atmosphere of happiness and peace. That beloved prince possessed, in fact, all the virtues necessary to be king of a victorious Salem. 9 Adonijah had built a special mansion next to the palace, with the purpose of offering it to the subject whose life most perfectly expressed the laws of the parchment. Daily he watched the inhabitants, searching among them for that person whom he wished to honor. 10 He was walking through Salem's malls, when through the chirping of birds, Adonijah heard a voice similar to that of his son. Turning to see who he was, he found a beautiful young man singing a song. When he contemplated on his face the brightness of wisdom and purity, Adonijah was glad to have found him whom he could honor. That young man, who was a faithful copy of the prince, was called Samuel. 11 Placing a ring on his finger, the king led him to the palace, where he was received by Melchizedek, who offered many presents, including the right to always be by his side. 12 Adonijah prepared a great banquet in honor of Samuel, for which all were invited. When he looked at him next to the king, the subjects cheered him with joy, crediting him as being the prince himself. 13 They exalted with joy the virtues of that beautiful young man, when Melchizedek manifested himself, placing himself with a smile to the right of his father. 14 At the banquet, Samuel was honored by all. He was really worthy of residing in the mansion of the mountain, for there was in him a perfect reflection of the virtues that crowned the beloved prince. Chapter 3. The sublime compositions of Melchizedek inspired the people to acts of kindness and peace. Music preserving harmony and peace. Samuel, Melchizedek's inseparable companion. Important revelations of Adonijah to his people about the future government of a victorious Salem. Samuel, guardian of the laws. Once Salem grew in happiness and peace. With joy, the subjects gathered every day at dawn to hear, sing and play the sublime compositions of Melchizedek, which inspired acts of kindness and peace. 2 Among friendships born and strengthened by virtue of harmonious music, the one that united the prince and Samuel stood out. Since he had begun to reside in the mountain mansion, Samuel had become his constant companion. Together they spent long hours, meditating on the laws of parchment. With admiration, the honest subject saw Adonijah's son transform those laws into beautiful songs. The sweet melodies were born from his lips like the perfume of a flower. 3 Aware of the importance of music in the preservation of harmony and peace in Salem, the prince, in addition to singing, began to devote himself to instrumental music, the lute being his favorite instrument. It was through that instrument that he was able to express with greater perfection the richness of his soul. 4 Of the 6 years of testing, 5 finally passed. Adonias, happy to see that until then all the inhabitants of Salem had remained loyal to the principles contained in the parchment, summoned them to a banquet, in which he would make important revelations. 5 Having taken their places before the throne, the subjects joyfully joined the voices singing the songs of peace, being ruled by Samuel. 6 After hearing them, the king, excited, addressed his son, hugging him in the midst of applause from the grateful crowd. Everyone recognized that peace and joy in Salem were largely due to the love and dedication of the beloved prince, who was the author of those sweet songs. 7 At that moment of recognition and gratitude, Adonijah revealed his plans kept until then secret. In a leisurely voice he told them. 8 Subjects of this kingdom of peace, my soul is full of joy to contemplate on your day your faces more radiant than in times past. Your clothes remain white and pure as when you received them from my hands. The harmony of your voices and instruments are better today. 9 Having said these words, the king added solemnly. 10 A year of trial still remains, at the end of which you will be examined. Remaining faithful as here, you will be honored by being confirmed as subjects of this kingdom of peace. However, if someone were found at fault, they will be banished, even if this trial brings us much sadness and suffering. 11 The king's words led the subjects to deep reflection. Everyone, examining himself, inquired reverently, will we be approved? 12 Surely they would be victorious, because they loved Salem and his laws, joined the voices in an expressive song of faithfulness. At the end of the song, Adonias revealed his great secret. 13 Those who are approved, inheriting this kingdom of peace, will receive my son as king, to whom I will give the glorified throne of this Salem Victorio-SA. 14 The revelation of the king was acclaimed by all with much joy. Adonijah, however, had not yet revealed all his plan, so asking for silence he continued. 15 My son will hold a special scepter, in which I will seal all the right of dominion. His scepter, symbolizing all harmony, will be a lute. 16 Before this revelation that sensitized everyone, the prince, prostrating himself at the feet of his father, cried, motivated by much joy. Meanwhile, everyone applauded him with euphoria, yearning to see the dawn of that day when peace would be victorious. 17 Adonijah, calling Samuel to be with his son, concluded by saying. 18 In the government of this victorious Salem, I have the purpose of making Samuel the first after Melchizedek. The parchment of the laws will be entrusted to him, and he must be the guardian of the honor of this triumphant kingdom. Chapter 4. Samuel lets himself be dominated by feelings of greatness and pride. He keeps his plans secret and tries to impose his concepts contrary to the law of parchment. Melchizedek manages to restore him to the path of humility and righteousness, but again falls to being dominated by pride and greed. 1 Samuel, knowing Adonijah's plans for Salem's future, was filled with euphoria. He was now gazing at that city like no other, imagining his future of glory. Considering the king's words that he would be the second in the kingdom, he let himself be dominated by a feeling of exultation. He who until then, in obedience to the laws of parchment, had lived a life of humility, began to take pride in his position. In his winding he felt by the throne, having Salem's subjects at his feet, praising his greatness with praise. Samuel, totally dominated by that feeling, did not realize that he was being driven along a dangerous road. The pride that seduced him was generating the selfishness that would later manifest in greed. A week after the revelation of Adonijah, the subjects promoted a party in homage to Melchizedek, the future king of Salem. Seeing him acclaimed for so many praises, Samuel had his heart snatched away by a strange feeling of envy, the result of pride and selfishness. He could not bear the thought of being left in the background. Wasn't he as beautiful and wise as the prince? It was almost impossible to disguise such a feeling of unhappiness. In times past, Samuel found indescribable pleasure in the moments when, beside the prince, he recited the laws contained in the parchment, which were transformed into beautiful songs. Now, such moments became unpleasant, for those principles contradicted their ideals. He decided, however, not to reveal his feelings of rebellion. He would support the old-fashioned parchment until, with his authority, he could exclude it from the new kingdom that would be established. Wouldn't he be the guardian of those laws? That victory would seek to achieve through its influence and wisdom. For judging to be able to influence the son of Adonias with his dreams of greatness, Samuel approached him with euphoria, and began to speak to him of the glories of the coming kingdom, where the two, covered with honors, would enjoy the praises of a victorious Salem. They would be the heroes of the most perfect kingdom established among men. The delirious words of the honest subject brought concern and sadness to the young prince's heart, for they did not reflect the teachings of love and humility of the parchment. Seeing his intimate friend in danger, Melchizedek, with a tenderness never revealed, led him to the side of the throne, where, taking the scroll, he began to read compassionately the following paragraphs. 7. Salem's kingdom will be affirmed on humility, for this virtue is the basis of all true greatness. 8. Humility is the fruit of love, being contrary to pride, which can keep a creature caught in dust, making it content with its limitations, deceiving it as if they were of infinite value. 9. Humility consists in forgetting oneself, and this, in a life of selfless service for others. 10. Samuel, struggling to cover up his indignation at the reading of the scroll that was outdated for him, said to the prince in a friend's advice. 11. My good friend, we will reign in a victorious Salem, which will shine well above this scroll, whose principles were faithfully fulfilled in these years of trial. Is not full freedom not the glory of Salem? Well, know that complete freedom will not coexist with these laws, whose objective is locked at the end of the 5 years. It is up to us to crown Salem with the honor of total freedom, which will generate endless happiness. Such freedom is impossible to exist under the limitations of the scroll. 12. The king's son shuddered a lot at his friend's words, which showed insanity. How to free him from that path of death? 13. No one in Salem, besides Melchizedek, knew Samuel's sad condition. With patience, the prince tried to make him aware of the real value of the parchment, whose laws could never be altered, as this would bring about the end of all peace. 14. The prince's advice finally awakened his heart. Meditating on his words, he became aware of being following a deceptive path. 15. Seeing in the eyes of the one who loved the tears of repentance so much, the son of Adonijah rejoiced in his victory over pride and selfishness. 16. The days that followed the liberation were full of accomplishments. The prince was even more friendly, willing to give all of himself so that his companion could continue triumphantly on the path of humility. In those days of jubilation, he was given the honor of knowing the scepter that was being molded. 17. In a moment of carelessness, Samuel, who had once again enjoyed peace in the spirit, allowed his heart to be possessed again by a feeling of greatness, which triggered a new storm in his soul. That feeling mixed with pride and greed came upon him when the prince showed him the golden lute, on which the seal of the entire domain was being printed. Chapter 5. Samuel formulates plans of conquest. He preaches to the subjects a false and misleading doctrine. Adonias perceives this rebellion and preaches the accuracy of the laws of the parchment to achieve peace and true freedom. Melchizedek offers them forgiveness and the opportunity to turn to righteousness. Samuel secretly meets with his followers and reveals his plan of conquest. From his mansion Samuel watched Salem in his morning glow. Seeing her, which ornate bride waiting for her king, she coveted her. In his delirium he began to formulate plans of conquest. He could already feel exalted on his throne, holding the precious scepter in his hands. Everyone would praise him as the liberator of the oppression of those laws. Salem would be a kingdom of complete freedom and pleasure. Dominated by this greed, he began to conquer plans of conquest. 2. Samuel decided to act subtly among the subjects, leading them to see on the parchment some inaccuracy to real freedom. In his deception mission, he would act with apparent goodness, showing interest in the growth of everyone's happiness. 3. Putting his plans into practice, he began to visit the subjects in their mansions, telling them about the glories of the coming kingdom, where they would enjoy complete freedom. 4. Great was his influence on Salem. Everyone admired his beauty and wisdom, having him as a perfect apostle of justice and love. No one could imagine that in the midst of that atmosphere of joy and gratitude a subtle trap was being placed, in the grip of which many could fall carelessly. 5. In his seductive mission, Samuel did not speak against the parchment. However, he praised him for having exercised a trial mission in those 6 years ready to end. In his logic, however, he tried to show that in the coming kingdom, when all were approved, they would be above those laws. His arguments, apparently correct, paved the way for him to openly affirm that in the new kingdom, the existence of parchment would be an obstacle to the realization of true freedom. 6. The seeds of rebellion thrown by Samuel would soon germinate in the hearts of many in Salem. This happened 6 months after Yom Kippur, when everyone's destiny would be sealed. A third of the inhabitants, seduced by the terrible deception, now exalted him, in complete disregard of the laws and the prince, whom they judged as outdated. 7. Adonijah, who suffered when he saw the rise of all this rebellion, summoned the subjects to an emergency meeting. On the face of all you could see the contrasting provisions. 8. In a compassionate voice, the king began to reveal to them, as he had never done before, the great importance of the laws recorded on the parchment, showing that they were the basis of all prosperity and peace. If such laws were excluded, all happiness and glory would be extinguished, leading to chaos. 9. After showing the need for the laws, Melchizedek, moved by a strong desire to save those he loved so much, lifted the scroll in front of everyone and, in a voice full of goodness, offered them forgiveness and the opportunity to start again on the path of peace. His words moved everyone, making even Samuel himself motivated at first. However, pride prevented him from repentance again. In this way, the honest subject, when he could still look regretfully toward the scroll, hardened in his rebellion, deciding to continue until the end. This decision, however, would not manifest it promptly, for he had idealized a treacherous plan. 10. At the end of the opportunity meeting, Samuel summoned his followers to a secret meeting, which was held under the blanket of the night, next to the Cedron Creek that was outside the walls of Salem. 11. After cursing the parchment and all those who defended it, he began telling them about his plans for revenge and betrayal. 12. As you know, the 6 years of trial are running out, subtracting as of today 24 weeks for the day of the coronation. If you would like to have me as king instead of Melchizedek, I can steal your scepter, taking over the kingdom. 13. Samuel began to explain to them the betrayal launches, giving them the proper guidance on how to act from that date. 14. We need to maintain an appearance of fidelity to the parchment and the prince until it is time to act. The blow will be given on the night before the coronation day. At midnight we sneak away from Salem. I will steal the scepter that night and, together, we will flee to the deep valley where the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are. There we will arm ourselves and march against Salem, subjugating our enemies. We will end then with the Pergamino and with all those who refuse to pay obedience to our government. Chapter 6. Samuel and his accomplices pretend fidelity to the kingdom. Confident Melchizedek shows Samuel the secret place of the golden lute. Samuel betrays Melchizedek's confidence by preparing his men and stealing the precious scepter. Samuel and his followers march towards the valley. Salem is in danger. 1 day of apparent tranquility and peace ensued. Samuel, feigning fidelity, was always at the side of the prince, showing admiration for his new compositions that exalted the laws of parchment. Samuel's followers, in the same way, united the voices in praises that expressed the greatness of the principles to which they disgusted. 2. Melchizedek, full of joy to see the day of his coronation approaching, rehearsed with the subjects the songs of victory, which he had composed especially for that occasion. He happily talked to everyone about his dreams of making Salem increasingly full of honor for his beauty and harmony. 3. Samuel, in his hidden wickedness, mocked the prince. He already foresaw the pain that would be caused by the betrayal. For in those days of apparent peace, the rebel subjects sought to know where the scepter would be hidden until the day of the coronation. The prince, without distrust, revealed all the secret: the room, the chest with its enigma, the rich case, and finally the treasure. Contemplating the cunning, Samuel was encouraged to see the seal of the domain printed on its convex part. He understood that he who possessed it would have Salem's kingdom in his hands. Only a few days, he thought, and he would have that precious instrument under his power. 5. The sun declined, bringing Salem the day that would mean victory or defeat. 6. Shortly before nightfall, Samuel had left the palace where he had spent the whole day next to the prince, helping him in the preparations for the coronation ceremony. Heading towards his mansion, he greeted the darkness with an evil smile. How much he had longed for that night. 7. While the faithful, bewitched by the excitement of the happy victory, reviewed under the light of candlesticks the ornaments of their instruments, their garments and mansions, certifying that they would be approved the next morning, Samuel and his followers made their final preparations to wield the blow. 8. At midnight, following Samuel's instructions, all his followers silently abandoned their mansions, heading for the deep valley of Cedron, where they would wait for their new king. 9. Samuel, in turn, went to the palace funds, where he hoped to enter without being noticed, going to meet the scepter. Avoiding making any noise, he crossed the portal, silently heading to the room that guarded the beautiful scepter. 10. At that moment, the prince, who sleeplessly rolled in his bed, feeling some danger, went to his father's room and woke him up, saying, 11. My father, I heard the sound of footsteps inside the palace. 12. Stroking the head of his son, Adonijah, sleepy replied, 13. Son, don't worry. Lie with me and sleep peacefully. From here the dawn will scratch and you will have the golden lute in your hands. 14. The prince, reassured by the reliable words of his father, gave himself to a dream of beautiful dreams in which he lived next to Samuel and all Salem's subjects, the festive moments of the coronation. While this was happening, the rebel with trembling hands seized the scepter. At that time, he had the idea of taking only the lute, leaving the case in its proper place. With a smile full of evil, he imagined the moment when the king would give his son that empty case. 15. Taking the scepter with him, Samuel hurried to the place where his followers were waiting for him. When he found them, he gave way to all his pride by proclaiming, 16. Now I am the king of Salem, who owns a scepter like mine. With it I dominate the land and the sea. My strength is in darkness because through them I conquered it. 17. Celebrating the victory, the noisy mob separated to distance themselves from Salem, following the corrupted cities of the plain, where they pretended to arm themselves for the conquest of their kingdom. 18. The sun appeared on the horizon, bringing the light of the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Waking up from his dream of beautiful dreams, the prince got ready for the ceremony of judgment and coronation. Special garments of fine linen, adorned with gold threads and precious stones, were prepared. After dressing, Melchizedek headed to meet his subjects, at the southern end of Salem. From there he would lead them on a festive march towards the palace to the north, on Mount Zion. 19. Adonijah, sounding a long horn, summoned everyone to the trial meeting. Leaving their mansions, all the remaining ones went towards the square of the south door, taking with them their musical instruments. 20. When he met those faithful, Melchizedek was surprised by the absence of many. That mystery hurt in his soul, for he hid the most beloved face of his friend Samuel. 21. Leaving his followers together, the prince went in search of the absent. In his unsuccessful search, he finally went to the mansion on the mountain where he called Samuel. His voice, however, brought no reply beyond an empty echo, which translated ingratitude. 22. Reading betrayal in the sad emptiness, he felt like crying. In a single moment the whole past came to mind of the one whom he had sought with such dedication to keep it in his glory, through wise advice. He remembered those days that followed his recovery, how he had rejoiced with the certainty that his friend would never fall again. Taking him to present the tragedy, Samuel's inquiries about the lute came to mind, which he showed in a gesture of friendship. The memory of this fact, added to the steps heard inside the palace that night, gave him the certainty that Salem was in danger. Not enduring that possibility of betrayal, he prostrated himself in tears, hurt by the terrible ingratitude of the one to whom he had dedicated so much love. 23. Curved by pain, he remained for some time trying to find some comfort. He finally dried his tears, determined to make any sacrifice in order to return his glory and power to Salem, redeeming the scepter from the hands of rebellion. 24. Consoled by the certainty of victory, Melchizedek returned to the side of the faithful subjects. Hiding their suffering as well as the reason for the absence of so many, the prince guided them in a triumphant march towards the palace. Chapter 7. Faithful subjects, oblivious to betrayal, raise songs of triumph in expectation of the coronation of their king. The coronation is truncated due to the absence of the scepter. Everyone grieves and Melchizedek comforts them with the promise of rescuing the precious scepter. Melchizedek goes out in his search. Samuel, full of anger, scrapes the inscriptions engraved on the scepter. Melchizedek faces dangers in search of the scepter and is preserved. As they approached Mount Zion, they climbed the very white steps of the stairs, being followed by the triumphant crowd. It hurt in his soul the expectation of seeing his cheerful song die on the lips of the faithful, that morning, due to the betrayal. 2. He was now inside the palace, before the magnificent throne that awaited the young king. At the base of the throne, the parchment of the laws lay open, in the middle of a floral arrangement. Next to him you could see the beautiful crown, made of gold and precious stones, as well as the case of that scepter that symbolized all the harmony of Salem. 3. The subjects were happy, for they knew they would be found worthy to inherit that kingdom of peace. They were waiting for the moment of the coronation, when their new king would rule them from his throne with his precious scepter, in a triumphant chant. 4. Amid the applause of the victorious hosts, Melchizedek turned to his father, who received him with a warm hug. The moment was truly solemn. The hosts were silenced in anticipation of the coronation. The case would be open and everyone would witness the exaltation of the beloved prince. 5. With his heart pounding with joy, Adonijah bent down to the case, opening it carefully. When finding it empty, the joy of his countenance gave rise to an expression of inexpressible concern and sadness, for in that scepter the fate of that kingdom of peace had been sealed. 6. Seeing his father and all the subjects afflicted by the absence of the scepter and so many friends who should be with them at that time, Melchizedek comforted them with the promise that he would seek the scepter. Unaware of the risks and dangers that awaited the prince on his way, the subjects said goodbye to him, watching him leave in haste. 7. The dawn of that day, which would be that of the coronation, reached the distant rebels of Salem, en route to the cities of the plain. On that morning, Samuel was filled with fury when he saw that the precious loot was adorned with inscriptions of the laws contained in the scroll. Taking a pointed stone, he began to damage the scepter, scraping away all the words of love and justice. His harmonious strings were now in tune over his wounded convex part, but he was still beautiful, for Salem's domain lay sealed on him. Owning it meant being the owner of all power. 8. When he reached the height where the road branched, Samuel ordered his followers to continue towards Gomorrah, while he would go to Sodom, where he would remain for 2 days, joining them later. 9. He waited for the night to enter Sodom. When he entered there, he walked through the narrow streets without being noticed, until he found an isolated house on an elevation. Making the scepter his weapon, he invaded the house, killing his inhabitants while they slept. He thus took possession of that residence where, alone, he would machine his plans for the sale of Salem. 10. The evening of that day, which would be the coronation, reached the son of Adonijah as he walked along the stony path to the valley. His eyes were full of sadness and anxiety, turned to the ground, looking for the traces of the rebels. The memory of the ingratitude of those whom he loved so much made him cry. His tears, reflecting the last flashes of that setting sun, resembled drops of blood flowing from a wounded heart. He cried not because of the dangers that came upon him on that cold night, but because of the unhappy fate of those who had changed Salem's peace because of the violence of those cities in the plain. 11. His only consolation was the memory of those who, despite all the temptations, had remained faithful. They had been promised to return the scepter, and this would be achieved despite any sacrifice. 12. After a long night of insomnia, when the prince was lying on the side of the road, he streaked the light of a day that would be decisive. 13. As he approached Sodom on that morning, the thought of being so close to the scepter of his beloved Salem made him forget all the fatigue, shortening his steps toward the challenge. 14. When the great gate of the city opened, a fear came upon him, upon hearing frightful noises of disharmony, which translated the pride, selfishness and greed that dominated all hearts, making them explode in the orgy of an endless evil. 15. It would be a great risk to expose yourself to the free violence of that city. This thought made him pause at a step from the portal, where he shuddered, bowed his forehead in an inexpressible internal struggle. He was tempted to retreat, but struggled with all his soul forces against that thought of failure. 16. Thinking of Salem's sad fate, whose dominion was being trampled inside that cruel Sodom, Melchizedek made a firm decision. As a reckless warrior he would have to move forward, and certainly even if he had to face the accumulation of all the dangers, he would continue, until he raised in his victorious hands the beloved scepter. 17. Resolute and hopeful, he went through Sodom's door, diving into that strange world. Everything there was the opposite of Salem, beginning with the rough and dirty stones of his constructions. Sodom was a kingdom of darkness. 18. The contrasting presence of the prince was soon noticed by many who, in tumult, surrounded him. The purity of the character expressed in his great face and the splendor of his garments filled them with horror, and they retreated as defeated by an invisible force. Dominated by fury, they began to chase him from a distance, determined to make him flee. He was thrown stones and mud trying to stain his clothes, but they did not hit him, Meanwhile he advanced in his anxious search. They finally gave up chasing him at sunset. Chapter 8. Melchizedek after much affliction finds the precious scepter that was destroyed by Samuel. The prince's dignified stance before the traitor's threats. His firm willingness to redeem the scepter at any cost. Pain and blood as the price of the scepter's rescue. The atonement of Melchizedek to redeem the scepter, a likeness of the atonement of Christ to redeem mankind. One the son of Adonijah traveled all the streets and alleys in search of the beautiful scepter, but it was in vain. Seeing the sun decline on the horizon, announcing the arrival of a dark and cold night, his heart was in great agony. There, in that last alley, almost defeated by exhaustion and despair, he bowed his forehead, fainting in tears. His lips pronounced in the middle of sobs the following words. To Salem, Salem, you can't perish. Your scepter needs to be redeemed from the grip of rebellion. But when and where will I find it? There are no more forces left in me, and the hope of redeeming him before night leaves me. 3. The prince, in his supreme anguish, did not perceive that another groan of pain, coming from busted strings of a humiliated lute, was heard in that evening. For suddenly the weak groan penetrated his ears, reviving him with the certainty that the great moment of redemption had come. Drying her tears, she gathered the last forces running in the direction of a small house on a hill, where the sound seemed to come from. 5. As he went to the door between the open, he stopped when he contemplated a contrasting scene of humiliating slavery. Samuel, wrapped in a dirty cloak, punished Salem's scepter. Both the young man and the scepter were so disfigured that there was almost no feature of the lost glory in them. That scepter, however, certainly raised as it was very valuable, for in it lay the seal of Salem's dominion. 6. The contemplation of the one who had been his best friend and of that idealized scepter as a symbol of all harmony, in such a tragic condition, deeply moved the prince, making him cry loudly. Only until then did the rebel subject perceive his unwanted presence. Shivering, he got up and, full of anger, asked him, 7. What brought you to Sodom? 8. Indicating towards the damaged scepter, Melchizedek exclaimed, 9. Salem's glory is destroyed. 10. With a laugh, Samuel mocked his sadness, saying, 11. Now I am the king of Salem. You who are faithful to the parchment will become my slaves. 12. Without giving importance to Samuel's words of affront, the prince, moved by infinite anguish, said, 13. Samuel, Salem is hurt by your betrayal. Why did you change your home of justice and love for this valley of injustice, hate and death? Now if you do not wish to return to Salem, return the scepter. It was to redeem it that, belittling all the dangers, I descended into this hostile valley. 14. Knowing the prince's purpose, the rebel was filled with rage and clenching his fists he said, 15. I hate you, Melchizedek. 16. Having said this, he threw the scepter to the ground and stomping on it added, 17. I have the desire to do the same with you. 18. In front of that affront, the prince felt no fear but compassion. Transporting himself to the happy past, he remembered the happy moments in which he always had Samuel by his side. He was a pure and humble young man of heart. Why had he allowed himself to be enslaved by the illusion of pride and selfishness? How painful it was to see that young man who, for his beauty and sympathy, had been honored above all subjects, now ruined by greed. Had it not been the prince's dream to have, beside his glorified throne, the one he considered the most precious friend? This tragedy hurt his soul. However, the sad condition of the scepter afflicted him even more, for this had been made as the symbol of all harmony, and was being destroyed under the feet of ingratitude. 19. Surprised not to see in Melchizedek's eyes any expression of fear, but of mercy, Samuel felt frustrated in his insults that aimed to intimidate him, leading him to give up his mission. 20. Before the dignified position of the prince, who contemplated him in silent pain, he felt ashamed. That weakness, however, was banished by the pride that dominated his heart. Then he began to plan something terrible, to humiliate and hurt the prince, making him suffer even more. With derision he said, 21. Salem's scepter may be yours, if you manage to pay me the price of your ransom. 22. With a gleam in his eyes, the prince asked him, 23. What is the price? 24. Samuel, with a mischievous smile, slowly replied, 25. The price is not gold or silver but pain and blood. You must undress completely of your clothes lying on the floor. You must endure in that condition blows until the sun sets. If you are willing to submit to me without reacting, the scepter will be entirely yours. 26. Shivering at such a cruel proposal, the son of Adonijah looked toward the sun that lay distant on a cloud. He then began to lock an intense fight in his heart. At first, the horror of the sacrifice almost dominated him, encouraging him to retire, but the thought of seeing Salem enslaved by rebellion finally led him to the decision to pay the ransom price, surrendering himself to humiliating suffering. 27 Having made the firm decision to rescue the scepter, the prince threw the clothes, placing them on a stone. He lay down immediately on that cold floor, his forehead turned toward the west. 28 Mercilessly, Samuel began to scourge him, using the scepter itself as an instrument of torture. Moaning at the pain of the blows that made him bleed, the prince kept his eyes fixed on the sun that seemed to stop over the cloud. Stunned by the pain, he finally watched the sun soon set. Encouraged by the approaching victory, he muttered in a low voice, 29, Jerusalem, Salem, from here I will have in your arms a precious scepter that, in my hands, will become an instrument of justice and peace. 30 Hearing the promise the prince made between groans, Samuel shouted at him furiously, 31, Your suffering will not bring any dawn to Salem, for your hands will never be able to touch in the scepter. 32 After making that affront, Samuel took possession of a pointed stone, preparing to deal the last blows. 33 While thinking of Salem's happy victory, Melchizedek felt his right arm being compressed by Samuel's feet. Following this rude gesture, a blow that made him contort in agony. His hand had been cruelly dug, beginning to pour abundant blood from the open wound. That same violence was later unloaded on his left hand. 34 Not enduring the agony caused by those heartbreaking blows, the son of Adonijah, bloodied, plunged into the darkness of a deep fainting. Chapter 9. Samuel, horrified by his guilt, leaves the prince, leaving the scepter next to him. Melchizedek regains consciousness, takes his clothes and his scepter, takes an oath and leaves for Salem. Samuel does not regret the similarity of the experiences of Melchizedek with whom the Son of God would live. Melchizedek is received with acclamations for his redemptive act, is attended by his loving father, and the scepter is restored. 1 When he stopped beating the prince, the rebel subject was possessed by a strange horror when he contemplated on the face of the one who had only done him good, the drowsiness of death. He tried not to remember the past, but irresistibly, he felt himself being dragged into the days of his happy innocence in Salem. Clothed in rich robes, he was always next to the prince who, with dedication, taught him his songs every day about peace. 2 In the unwanted memories by which he was dragged, he revived his first steps on the path of pride and selfishness. He remembered the incessant advice and pleas of the one who had been his best friend, to give up that path that could lead him to unhappiness. 3 After being dragged in memories by all that past of happiness destroyed by his fault, Samuel was aware of his ingratitude. Horrified by what he had done, he leaned over Melchizedek's bloody body, and despaired when he saw him lifeless. Not bearing the burden of great guilt, he left that place hurriedly, wishing to hide away under the darkness of the cold night. For after a deep fainting, the prince began to regain consciousness. In delusions that transported him to the heart of his beloved Salem, he lived and dreamed moments. With joy he contemplated the face of his best friend, to whom he extended his hand with a smile. But his gesture was frustrated by deep pain. Amid the applause of the victorious subjects, he received the scepter from his father, but when he touched it, he felt an irresistible pain in his hands. 5 With these dreams frustrated by pain, Melchizedek awoke to reality. He was naked, hurt and lonely in a dangerous place, away from Salem's coat and affection. More painful was to think that all that had been the retribution of someone who had been the main target of all the gifts of his love. 6 The prince, unable to move, considering the great betrayal, began to cry without comfort. He regretted not for his pain, but for the downfall of those who had changed Salem's love and justice for the contempt and hatred that would finally reduce them to ashes over that damned valley. 7 Through the tears, the prince watched the sky that, like a cloak inked with blood, stretched in the light of the setting sun. He remembered then the loot for which he had paid such a high price. Where would he be? 8 In his desperate escape, Samuel had left the scepter abandoned next to Melchizedek's wounded body. When he saw it, he forgot all the pain and hugged him with his wounded hands. Stroking the ruined convex part with a smile, he said, 9 You are mine again. I bought you with my blood. 10 Samuel, who, dominated by the strange horror, had fled after committing the horrible crime, stopped a step away from Sodom's door. There, driven by pride, he repented with indignation at his weakness. Why had he fled after winning such a great victory? Wasn't his plan to destroy the kingdom of Salem, to establish his own kingdom? Remembering the scepter, he decided to return to take it. Why had he left him abandoned next to the corpse of that hated prince? 11 Gathering his few forces, Melchizedek went dumbfounded to the place where he had left his clothes. 12 After dressing, having the beloved scepter by the chest, the son of Adonijah, with deep emotion, made an oath before leaving that place of his suffering. Stroking the scepter he said, 13. My beloved scepter, you were created as an emblem of harmony that comes from justice and love. All the glory of Salem rested upon you when the rebellion in his ingratitude enslaved you, dragging you into this hostile valley. Here you were hurt and humiliated, becoming an instrument of impiety in the hands of the tyrant. I, however, redeemed you with my blood. Now our wounds will be restored, and soon we will be enthroned amid the praises of a victorious Salem. When this dream comes true, we will witness together the end of those who rose against us to hurt us. Salem and his followers will be devoured by the fire that will reduce Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes. 14 Concluding his solemn oath, the young prince, already hidden by the darkness of the night, left that hill, and on it the marks of his suffering. 15 Since the king's son had left, promising to return with the scepter, Salem lived moments of unspeakable anxiety. In tears, the king and the remaining subjects remembered all that happy past broken by the ingratitude of the rebels. What tortured them most was the absence of the prince and the scepter, without which all the brightness of that kingdom of peace would be obfuscated. 16 Desiring to comfort the hearts of his subjects, Melchizedek advanced in the middle of the night towards the mountains that surrounded Salem. Still weakened and injured, he continued on his upward march, hoping to reach his homeland in the morning. 17 That long dark night was finally overcome by the rays of dawn. In Salem, the hope of seeing Melchizedek again with his scepter was almost abandoned when, looking at the Mount of Olives, they saw him descending down the road to Gethsemane. When they found him in the deep valley of Cedron, they were frightened with his appearance. His face was pale and his mantle soaked in blood. Precisely still, he smiled, expressing great joy. 18 When they asked him about the reason for those blood marks, Melchizedek took out his wounded hands from under his mantle, showing them in their midst the redeemed scepter. 19 After telling them the steps that led him to the rescue of the scepter, the muted subjects bowed reverently at his feet, acclaiming him as their Redeemer and King. 20 In the midst of the praises of the redeemed hosts, the prince was introduced into the royal palace, where under the care of his loving father, he should recover from his suffering. The disfigured scepter, now more precious, would also be restored, having to become even more beautiful than before. 21 The coronation day was set for the next Yom Kippur. On that day, Melchizedek would seal with the restored scepter the triumph of all the faithful, as well as the condemnation of the rebels. Chapter 10 Samuel, not finding the prince's body or the scepter, leaves for Gomorrah and is received as king by his men. Samuel and his followers increase in iniquity and pride. Through terror it conspires the kings of the plain and incites the war against other kings. Samuel and his men are defeated and hide in caves. A few moments after Melchizedek's departure, Samuel arrived at the place where he had apparently left him lifeless, next to the lute. Without understanding that mysterious disappearance, he went on to Gomorrah, where his followers were waiting for him. When he saw them, he proclaimed his victory over the hated prince and over the scepter, whom he had massacred in Sodom, not subtracting any hope from the followers of the parchment. His words pleased the rebel mob, who began to commemorate the conquest by giving himself to the orgy. They were mocking justice and love now, exalting Samuel as a victorious king. Now they would obtain weapons with the purpose of advancing on Salem, settling the last blow. They joined them in their evil purposes, many criminals who were received as masters in the handling of bows and arrows. In his madness, Samuel ordered the expulsion of every calendar, since in his kingdom of freedom, they would not be subject to any computation of time. The laws of morality were also excluded, resulting in complete chaos. This disorder manifested itself more clearly in the raucous and cacophonic noise, which they proclaimed as the new music. Dominated by selfishness, Samuel and his followers fed on illusions, unaware that their days were numbered. The fruits of rebellion would soon attract the fire of destruction upon them. By dividing his followers into small groups, Samuel began to command them in violent acts that terrified the inhabitants of the plains. At that time, they hid in the caverns located near the Salt Sea. The respect and fear of the Samuel guerrillas finally led the kings of 4 cities to procure it, proposing peace alliances. They were Bara, king of Sodom; Bursa, king of Gomorrah; Sinab, king of Adama; Semeber, king of Seboim; and Sejer, the king of Bela. At that time, these kings paid tribute to Chordolamer, the king of Elam, who, accompanied by the armies of 4 other cities, had subjugated them in the Siddim Valley by the Salt Sea. 8. Strengthened by alliances, Samuel became more daring in his clothes, bringing terror and destruction to the territories of distant cities. Coeur d'Alemer's armies and their allies, who in those days returned from other conquests, enraged by Samuel's provocations, marched against the four kings, defeating them again in the Siddim Valley. It was on that occasion that they took captives to the inhabitants of Sodom, among which was my nephew Lot. 9. Cowed before the fury of the 5 kings, Samuel and his followers hid in their caves, north of the Salt Sea. Chapter 11. Samuel makes preparations to conquer Salem and exposes his spy plan. On his way to Salem, his memories torture him. Salem more beautiful and beautiful than before. Events on the day of the coronation. 1. The 12 months from the great sacrifice were almost over. The scepter, fully restored, shone in its case, while the prince, equally restored from the wounds caused by the rebellion, was glad to see the Yom Kippur coming from his coronation. Meanwhile, he composed beautiful songs that expressed his love for Salem. 2. In those 12 months, the city of peace became more beautiful, being adorned as a bride for the great day of the coronation. 3. A week to Yom Kippur, Samuel, totally unaware that the day of his trial was approaching, gathered his followers, announcing that the next mission would be the conquest of Salem. Before they advanced, however, he would climb only to check the vulnerable points of the city. For after being applauded by the mob, Samuel set out on his reconnaissance mission. While he was advancing alone, he tried not to remember those moments that brought him terror by guilt, but, dominated by a superior force, he was dragged in his memories to that mountain of cruel torture. 5. His whole past began to come to mind like a crumbling weight. 6. When he woke up from his memories from which he failed to flee, it was already night. The darkness that surrounded him seemed the omen of a sad ending. That discouragement, nevertheless, tried to discard it with the memory of the army that was waiting for him, ready to fulfill his orders, in the conquest of Salem, where there would be no more memories of that parchment. 7. Dawn reached him being close to Salem. When he saw the Mount of Olives, the memory of the last time he crossed it came, leaving behind the defeated city. How many nights had passed since then? He had lost track of time, not knowing that exactly 12 months had passed. He could not imagine that Yom Kippur was on that morning, the day of his trial. 8. Upon reaching the summit of the Mount of Olives that morning, Samuel was surprised to see that the city had become prettier than before. All of it was adorned with bouquets and flowers, like a maiden waiting for her boyfriend. And yet Salem was abandoned, having no sign of life in all its mansions. This led him to conclude that the blows that had annihilated the prince and the scepter had resulted in all that abandonment. He did not know, however, that at that time all the remnants of that kingdom were hidden in the great hall of the palace, waiting for the most glorious moment of the coronation of Melchizedek. 9. Imaging himself exalted on the abandoned throne, having victorious armies at his feet, the rebel entered the city, hurrying to the palace. When crossing the main portal that gives entry to the main hall, he was filled with astonishment to see a crowd of faithful gathered there. On a gold table, adorned with flowers carved in precious stones, was the empty throne. At the base of the throne was the parchment of laws, a gold crown full of precious stones, and the case he had left empty on that night of betrayal. Without understanding the puzzle, Samuel hid behind a column, fearing to be recognized, and kept watching. 10. The subjects, with the expression of happy expectation, looked towards the empty throne. Where did they find reasons for all that joy, if they had lost their king along with the scepter? Samuel wondered about that mystery when Adonijah, applauded by the subjects, headed for the throne. With a voice full of excitement for the victory, the founder of Salem announced that the dream of the coronation had arrived. A shout of triumph echoed through the air when, announced by his father, the beloved prince entered, heading for the throne. Seeing him covered by a mantle of glory, Samuel was possessed by a terrible dread, and attempted to flee. He discovered, however, that all the portals of the great hall were closed on the outside. 11. The coronation ceremony began. It was a truly solemn moment. Adonijah, in a reverent gesture, took the rich crown, placing it on his son's forehead. After leaning toward the case, he opened it carefully, taking out the restored lute, whose beauty and brightness were far superior to his first condition, as his waterhouse left Adonijah's hands. Sitting on the throne amid the acclamations of the subjects, Melchizedek began to play the scepter, drawing chords of great harmony and peace from him. Everyone quieted down to hear his new compositions expressing his deep love for the scepter and for all that kingdom of peace. 12. Great emotion invaded everyone's heart at that moment, bringing them to tears. Samuel, without the strength to react, felt tortured by those chords that tortured him by reliving his lost opportunities in his mind, in a terrible torture for his conscience. 13. Melchizedek had composed for that special moment, songs that portrayed the highlights of Salem's history. When he began to sing about the friendship he had for Samuel, his voice was filled with tears that he could not contain. It was sad for him to sing about the fall of the one who had been his greatest friend. He sang then about the high price he had to pay for the reconquest of the scepter, which represents the honor of Salem. 14 When contemplating those hands marked by the scars, touching with such mastery and affection the restored scepter, the subjects taken by a strong emotion, prostrated themselves in tears. 15 Seeing in the hands of Melchizedek that lute that in his hands had been an instrument of torture, Samuel understood, too late, how much he had erred, deviating from the prince's advice. How many times those hands on which he had discharged all that violence had been extended in an effort to save him, and he had neglected them negligently. Now it was too late. Extremely late. Chapter 12. An angel appears to Melchizedek in his dreams, instructs him and shows him in vision the celestial Salem. Melchizedek, the protector of the broadest revelations of God. Salem's story, a similarity to the history of the universe. Melchizedek, it moves and honors the Messiah, discovering that it became a likeness of him. Battle for the disputed scepter. Judgment Day. When going to bed after that day of so many emotions, the young king, immersed in the memories of that past of happiness and pain, rolled in his bed without sleep. When he finally fell asleep, he had a very significant dream. In the dream, a luminous angel appeared to him, who greeted him with a smile, told him that the entire universe accompanied with attention all that drama he was living, which had a prefigurative sense, portraying past and future events, which involved the whole vast universe. The words of the angel awoke in Melchizedek a great desire to know the history of that cosmic drama. Foreknowing his living desire, the angel snatched him in the dream, revealing a distant future. In front of his eyes the glories of a new and splendid Salem were manifested, whose walls and mansions were made of precious stones. The portals of the city were made of pearls. Its wide avenues were of pure gold. The city was quadrangular and stretched for hundreds of kilometers. It was divided into two distinct sectors, north and south. To the south stood countless mansions, eternal rooms of angels and redeemed human beings. To the north there was a beautiful paradise which the angel revealed to be the Garden of Eden. There, on both sides of the river of life, there were fields full of all kinds of vegetation, with flowers and fruits in abundance. They lived there in perfect harmony, all species of insects, birds and animals. In the middle of paradise you could see a bright mountain, which the angel claimed to be Mount Zion, the place of God's throne. It was from that mountain that emanated the river of life, flowing throughout the city. When they had reached the summit of the sacred mountain, the king of Salem was dazzled by the scenery seen around him. It was in the highest part of Zion, the most beautiful of all the buildings revealed by the angel as the palace of God. That magnificent construction was supported by 7 columns, all of transparent gold, embedded with beautiful pearls. Around the palace the most exuberant vegetation flourished. There were pine, cypress, olive, dead, rosemary and fig trees, doubling the weight of their ripe figs. While admiring the beauty of that place, the angel told him that no human being had been given the privilege of seeing inside that palace of God. He would be given this honor, as he was chosen to be the bearer of the broadest revelations about the kingdom of light. When they revered with reverence one of the pearl portals, they prostrated themselves in adoration, while they heard the song of a multiplicity of seraphim, which circled the throne, in constant praise to the one who was, that is and that will always be. Looking at the one who was sitting on the throne, Melchizedek was surprised to discover the figure of a man. He was covered by a mantle of fine linen, of an unparalleled whiteness, and had on his head a crown formed by 7 overlapping crowns, full of precious stones. Looking at the hands that held the scepter, the son of Adonijah was surprised to discover in them scars of wounds, similar to those on his hands. The angel claimed to be the Messiah, the visible manifestation of Yahweh, the invisible God. 11 Attracted by the shining scepter with which the Messiah ruled over the entire universe, the king of Salem saw in him the seal of dominion, and in it the name was written, Israel. 12 Struck by a deep emotion, Melchizedek prostrated himself before the king of that eternal Salem, and reliving the history of his small town there, he had the desire to know the great drama of universal history. Knowing the desire of his heart, the angel said, 13. Now I will tell you the story of this glorious Salem. Everything that will be shown to you in the vision, you must faithfully record in 6 scrolls that will be sewn to each other, forming a single scroll. You will have 6 years to write them. At the end of the 7 years, you will receive from the hands of an old man a vase containing a special scroll, with many important revelations highlighting Salem's story. You will take that roll and sew it as the first of the 7, forming a single roll. After sealing it, you and the old man will keep it in the vase, taking it to a cave that I will show you north of the Salty Sea, where it will remain forgotten until the last days arrive, when it will be rescued and revealed to the world through a small Bedouin. 14. After telling the king of Salem these words, the angel led him in vision to an infinite past, when the universe did not yet exist. 15. A story very similar to Salem's began to unfold before his eyes, but in an infinitely larger dimension, beginning with the creation of the kingdom of light. With admiration he contemplated the formation of billions of worlds and stars, full of life and happiness that began to revolve around the celestial Salem, the paradise of God. 16. His attention then turned to the most beautiful of all the cherubs who, honored by the Creator, began to dwell with him in his palace. An age of happiness and peace seemed to enchant that kingdom, when the same experience of selfishness and rebellion lived by Samuel began to be repeated in the life of that beloved angel. 17. Scenes from a great rebellion began to be shown to Melchizedek, involving all the inhabitants of the universe. The honest cherub, similar to Samuel, had seduced a third of the host who began to revere him as king. 18. Amid the scenes of that great conflict, the king of Salem witnessed the creation of planet Earth, upon which man emerged as the rational scepter of that disputed kingdom. 19. In agony he saw the moment when the head of the rebellion approached paradise subtly, seizing the human being, after seducing him with temptations. Then he heard his bellow in a proclamation of victory. From that moment the enemy of God began to ruin the human being, extinguishing in him all the features of divine glory, as Samuel had done with the scepter. 20. His own experience, when he declared that morning to Salem's subjects his decision to go in search of the lost scepter, began to repeat itself before his eyes. 21. Gathering the hosts who had remained faithful to his government, the Creator began to reveal a rescue plan. He would go in search of man and would redeem him, even if it cost him an infinite sacrifice. In front of this revelation, the son of Adonias was moved prostrate, when discovering that in his life he had been honored to portray Messiah himself. 22. All the drama lived by the son of Adonijah in his anguishing search, until the moment of his ordeal for the redemption of the scepter, was gaining amplitudes in that vision that covered an entire eternity. In front of his eyes paraded scenes of a great battle that, without truce, would extend until the day of the final judgment, when the victorious Messiah will wield the redeemed scepter, sealing with him the condemnation of all rebel hosts. Chapter 13. Melchizedek had knowledge of the great liberation due to the revelations that were manifested to him by the angel of the Lord. Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Lot and their 2 daughters as well as the shepherds and faithful, are welcomed with joy in Salem. To celebrate the feast of Sukkot, Abraham delivers the scroll to Melchizedek, and he sews it by joining it to his own. After reading part of Abraham's scroll, Melchizedek blesses little Isaac and prophesies concerning the future of the scroll. 1. Through the revelations received from the angel, Melchizedek became aware of the great liberation reached 10 days before his coronation in Rosh Hashanah, when in front of 300 shepherds with their vases lit, armies of 5 kings had fallen, freeing the captives. 2. Knowing our intention to go up to Salem for the occasion of Sukkot, the king made preparations for a great party, in which we would commemorate together the victory over all the disharmony generated by pride and selfishness. 3. It was for this reason that when we arrived in Salem, we were surprised with all that honorable reception. For to deal with the story of all these events, made me go through this whole 7th year, almost without noticing his days, which passed quickly. We are today at the gates of a new Rosh Hashanah, when the 300 shepherds will play the horns, summoning all those who possess the pearls for the solemn meeting of Yom Kippur. 5 days later we will be received in Salem for the Sukkot party. 5. The certainty that important events should still be reported until the moment when the vase will be left in the cave, makes me reserve a space in the roll, in which I will record, day after day, the facts, until the consummation of this history. 6. Today is Rosh Hashanah, the happiest day of my life, for my arms can finally embrace the Son of Promise. The first thing Sarah did when she received it, was to place in her right hand the second pearl that the Messiah had given her on the day of her conversion, on which was written the name Isaac, which means laughter, the name of Melchizedek and the name of Salem. 7. 2 days before Yom Kippur, Isaac was circumcised according to Yahweh's order. 8. Since the shepherds began to play their horns in Rosh Hashanah, all those who possessed pearls from the vase left their tents, heading in small groups to be next to the Mamre oak. 9. When Yom Kippur arrived on the day of the solemn meeting, My pastors informed me that all those who had received pearls had appeared at the meeting, not missing any person. It was wonderful to see the joy stamped on the face of all that crowd, who longed for the climb to Salem. Everyone had a story to tell, how they were misunderstood and humiliated by those who did not receive the salvation represented by pearls. The only consolation they had at that time came from the certainty that they would go up to Salem for Sukkot's party. 10 On the first day of Sukkot's feast, the crowd was subdivided into small groups of 12 people, to get in order to Salem. 11 Having the vase with the scroll on my back, I placed myself in front of the crowd, being followed by Sarah and Isaac, who were riding a camel. Then behind were Lot and his daughters, and a little further back the 300 pastors, followed by all the faithful. 12 We began our ascent when, accompanied by all his subjects, Melchizedek appeared coming to meet us, making the festive sound of many musical instruments vibrate through the air, commemorating the great victory. 13 After greeting us, the son of Adonijah led us on a festive march until he introduced us to the gates of Salem, which was now more beautiful than before. 14 Before the throne, all the redeemed were crowned by Melchizedek, immediately beginning the great banquet. 15 Great was the joy of the king of Salem when I handed him the vase with my manuscript. Taking me to a special room in the palace, he showed me the 6 manuscripts in which he had recorded the history of the universe, as he had been shown in his dream. 16 Upon receiving my manuscript, he showed it to others, becoming the first of the great scroll. 17 On the last day of Sukkot's feast, the scroll was opened in front of the entire crowd of faithful. After reading a good part of my manuscript, the son of Adonijah, taking in his arms the little Isaac, said, 18 In the offspring of this child, all the things written in this manuscript must be fulfilled. 19 Having said this, the king blessed him, returning him to Sarah. 20 After blessing Isaac, Melchizedek began talking about the future of the scroll that would remain for almost 4 millennia hidden in a cave, being finally found by a Bedouin from the Tamaret tribe. Upon leaving his cave, the scroll would face the opposition of many scholars who would declare him apocryphal. The time would come, however, when his revelations would be confirmed, and many would be transformed by his messages, preparing for the day of the final judgment.